have in the sector. What I want to talk about today has to do with the different permissions that we have today. And in that sense, I don't know if we can continue with the presentation, please. In that sense, I would like to remind you the context that we have today, because this is a Congress where we're talking about desalination and reuse, but we cannot talk about those topics without first consider these topics as well. Droughts, wildfires. So we're talking about desalination and reuse of water in a context of climate change, as the minister said. And what does it mean? That also the laws have to adapt to the new challenges brought by climate change. And in comparison to previous years, we can say that, at least in the normative aspect, we have good news. For example, after so many years, finally, last year, we had the much expected framework law of climate change. This has a lot of public policies and plans that aim to cover all the impacts that the representative of the DGA is going to tell us about. We also have a guideline about the description of desalinator plants, which was given by the environmental authority, and it gives us a lot of guidelines on how we must present these projects in environmental issues and how they are going to have an influence on the marine ecosystems. We also have a guideline, a methodological guideline by the SEIA, which is the environmental authority, about the effects of climate change and how we must consider the effects of climate change into the planning of our projects when we submit them to be evaluated in terms of their environmental aspects. So in this sense, although we have some guidelines and some certainties, there are also several questions that still exist regarding desalinator plants. In which cases must they come into the environmental assessment system? What are the demands or the requirements that are going to be imposed onto them? And also in terms of the community, what are the environmental impacts? Am I going to have water? Am I going to have rationing of water? There are several questions like that remaining in the sector. What I think, however, is that there are some certainties, or at least some relative consensus that we have in our country. And as a good news, desalinator plants have been considered as one of the measures of adaptation for the effects of climate change. And if we take a look into those policies, these plans, this national policy, long-term policy for climate change, desalination plants are considered, and reuse plants are also considered as a way to adapt to climate change, and that's it for shortage. Now, there's a relative agreement that these projects must be developed in a sustainable way. And in that sense, desalination projects must not only adapt to the effects of climate change, but also contribute to mitigate the effects of climate change. And for example, there's a very concrete issue on how we reduce our greenhouse gases pollution by using, for example, renewables in our plants. But another point that's also very relevant, and there's a huge consensus, is the opportunity in which these projects must be ready. It's not enough that they are ready in 20 more years if the effects of climate change are happening now and here. So in this context of how we can achieve sustainable but also timely projects is why permits are very important. And here, to mention some ideas, we can go into that later, but what are some of the normative challenges that we have in terms of the project, the permits to reach these goals? And the first challenge is how we can unify the criteria and give certainty. And as the superintendent said, there's not a lot of regulation today in terms of desalination. So, in the list of projects that must be submitted into the environmental agency, we don't have a category for desalination plants. They are sometimes submitted as subwater emissaries, or they are related to the type of water and so on, but there's no specific type for them. And now, obviously, this produces some of the effects by Article 11, that it has an effect on some of the components such as water, air, it affects the communities and so on. Then it must be submitted, and it must be submitted for an EIA. And this is a lot more than just a simple evaluation in terms of environmental assessment. But there's still a lot of uncertainty on how it is submitted into the SEA. Now, to continue with the unification of the criteria and give certainty, we have also made some progress in the law projects, the bills that are being discussed. One of the most important is the reform for the SEA, which seeks precisely to add a typology for desalination plants. It also seeks to eliminate the pertinency consultation plant, which is something that's often demanded by the contractors.
In order to accelerate timing, and also we need to look for the flexibility in terms of the citizen participation in order to have less requirement and also for people to participate in this sort of project. We also have some other bills that I mentioned them because they are going to cover that gap that we've got, but the most important is this reform to the SEA and the bill that was entered back in 2018 that wants to regulate the desalination plants in general that has been paralyzed, but it seems that it's going to be resumed, and also the desalination plants will have some sort of this plants will mandatory be part of the system. The second regulation that we can find is that these projects will respond to the climate urgency. So this framework, we will have this principle of climate change. So everything that we need to do, they need to consider the lack of time that we've got, that this delay will have an impact in the effect of the climate change. And once again, the permits are one of the biggest barriers that we may find in order to have the permits on time. And I would like to give you some ideas just from this week, not only for the projects of desalination, but the ones in general, that talks about the ones that are delayed in the Committee of Ministers, or different projects that are being delayed because of bureaucracy or different organizations in the sector. So this is a topic that normally we can find in the press. And if we talked about this, and desalination, probably one of the kings of the delay of the permits are the sea concessions. And here we can see the recent report of the Committee of this, and also the key points in the delay of the projects that has to do with the sea concession. This is the summary of the findings and the clear recommendation that we need to speed things up and decompress this sort of permits that sometimes it will take 2 or more years. And of course, this is without talking about the MCO, for the regional peoples, that is a real headache when we are going to deal with this premise. So when we talk about the urgency, this is something else. We've got small progresses, and there is a bill that maybe you don't all know, but they just want to speed up the timing of the construction times that some projects like this one were required. And also this reform of the SEA would want to speed things up, at least within the environmental system, and the famous bill to speed the projects up, and they said that the executive was going to enter this by the end of the year, and by the press or some seminars, and the Minister of Economy presented some of the characteristics of this. But what we want to have is some sort of framework law that will set a certain maximum deadlines so that the authority will talk about certain permits and the administrative silence. So if certain times happens and nothing happens, then we understand that the permit is approved. There's certain thresholds for some projects, or a certain project of a smaller scale that will not need a permit, or just a short declaration of the owner. And then there is an authority that is in charge of doing the implementation of this permits. Then we will need to see the detail of how this is going to work, but also modification to the sectorial areas. And today we've got 380 permits of this sort. So the idea is to reduce this amount of permits and to make it uniform for the requirements and the timing for this permit. So this is a project that is quite expected, and we don't have much details. And then we're going to have a reform to this MCO, which is one of the biggest topics of the sea concessions. And just to close, these are the two challenges that are very important, and when we're able to accelerate the projects on the permits, it cannot mean that we will have some projects that do not comply with environmental standards. We need to have a robust project, such as it was mentioned by the SEA, and there is responsibility of the owners of the project. So when we enter this project to these systems of the environmental impact assessment, to read the guidelines. Guidelines are quite specific with lots of details. There are many topics, but that will give us an idea of what are the presentations. And we have found some desalination plants that in the end they finished their assessment because they didn't include all the information that was needed to report about the project. And the second thing is the citizen participation. And maybe we will see the reform of this SEA also will include an early citizen participation of a voluntary aspect, but we can save us some conflicts and save some times if we've got a closer meeting with the communities. And also the last thing, just to finish, is also it is also very important that sometimes we forget about it, but it's also very important that we need to improve the institutionality and to have a comprehensive management of water, because there are many aspects that interfere in some aspect related to water, and we've got the DGA that has most of the permits, but sometimes they don't have the necessary resources to be in charge of all of this. So if we want better projects and better permits, then we need to have an institutionality that will be in charge of all of this, and that will have the enough resources for this. Thank you, María José. That was quite comprehensive. I would like to tell you that María José is a Master of Law from Sydney University. She is currently a partner of Zegers ABOGADOS, leading the area of natural resources and also the National Society of the Natural Resources, and she is an attorney from University of Chile. So we will give the Q&A for the end of the panel. Francisco Echeverria, please do your presentation. We're going to say right away that Francisco, he is an attorney from the Catholic University, former director of waters, and now he is a part of the H2O lawyers, and he is an expert in the water resources aspect. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Aladyr. The idea of this presentation is not go into the hard regulation part, but to give you some ideas and to analyze in general terms the status of the situation in terms of the water reuse, and especially in the great waters and also with the sewage water. When we talk about residual water, in the reutilization, I would say that we've got lots of opportunities and challenges. We've got a recent regulation that was approved because this regulation is from the year 2011, and this is on a permanent discussion. We need to have a more concrete application, and so many times it is because we've got the specific regulation for the wastewater treatment, and also some modifications that were produced because we've got the 21,075 Act that has to do with the reuse of water, and also we need to have its practical application. So when we talk about these challenges, so this is a current challenge because we've got this system that is key for the water assurance and to look for new sources. On this regard, the country needs new sources of resources, not only to make sure of the human consumption, but also for the development. We used to talk that there was a bottleneck for the development of energy, but today that bottleneck is in terms of the water resources to back up the economical development and the social development that the country needs. So on this regard, they'll look for new sources such as the reutilization of treated water, desalination of the reuse of or the treatment of sewage water. That is something that is going to be in the air for quite a long time. So in a specific figures, was mentioned by the superintendents. Last year, we've got 1,225 million cubic meters of wastewater that were treated in Chile. This is a number that is quite important, and in theory, those over 1,000 cubic meters of water are available for. There is a mistake, but it is 1,000,225 cubic meters. So what did that mean? That 73% was discharged in continental shallow waters, that means rivers, and shallow waters of the continent. 21% went to the sea, and 6%, only 6% was reused, mainly in the agricultural sector. So this 1,225 million, and what corresponds to this, 33% of urban underwater emitters, they've got a flow of 8 cubic meters, and the 6% that was reused, 62% was done in the agricultural sector, the 18% was in the mining sector, and the 0.1% was done in the industrial sector. So with these figures, we can see what is the magnitude of this, and also in some sectors that can be quite important, and because in the end this is amount of water that is available for new uses or to back up in the uses that today we will have in this shortage of water. The importance of this is to see how this water is discharged, because we've got some regulations in terms of what goes to the rivers, because there is a legal discussion that is not given, and sometimes that will depend who is the owner of those waters that are discharged in the continental shallow waters, because in the numbers that we analyzed not long ago, the 73% of those 1,225 million cubic meters of water are the ones that went to the continental waters. So there is a problem with the ownership, because many of that waters are going to be used today by the agriculture, and the farmers, they feel that they are by the owners of that water because they are using that for irrigation, and they do believe that that water corresponds to the ownership of that water because it is part of a process that they are using today. It is like a leakage, but that is a discussion that hasn't been finished, and that is very important for the future. And well, regarding the current regulation in this bulletin, which is the 15,765 that provides an amendment to the Act 21,075, which is not regulated, that has to do with the forest and agricultural sector, with some uses that were outside the discussion of this law. And now this is open for the crops of fruits, of the ones that were not forbidden by law. Today are being considered in the use of certain areas, such as the green grass or is for seed. Today we can reuse water. That will open the possibility that there is financing for the National Committee of Irrigation, which is also very important, and certain projects will be financed and also could be used in the agriculture, and we will have an education to the regulation that is being in and out from the Controller's office during the last years. And with this, we've got 6 months to adequate the regulation to this new regulation. So in the end, that is going to be used to adequate the regulation. And for once and for all, this is going to be updated from the Controller's office. And what we are discussing, there is an important bulletin, which is the 15,690, and that is for the certification of the Senate, that is looking for the discharges of those emissaries, the submarine ones that will comply with the Supreme Decree, and that regulates the discharges of continental waters, and those discharges of those emissaries will comply with this Supreme Decree 90 regarding the water quality that those discharges will have. And also the service provided, they will have to have at least of a 35% of reutilization of those water that were discharged by the emissaries. And once again, we will have important challenges because, as the superintendent said, the cost of the treatment is very important. The rate, that is also very important, and the property of that is important for the industry, for whoever wants to use it. And there is a discussion that is very important in terms of the legal availability of who is going to do this treatment. There is no clarity that is being in discussion. So we need to see what is the level of discretion that we will have when negotiating this wastewater that are going to be treated. So if we can have a certain swap, and that is something that we should analyze, and that is important to be part of the discussion among the Congress members. And how can we include this within transnational options? Because it is important to mention the new Article 293 bis, because in each watershed we will have it in a context of climate change, and this is going to be a public plan. So the important thing about these plans is that in one of these orientation we will have an availability to implement these sources for the reuse of water, with an emphasis of a solution based on nature, such as desalination, the reuse of the crop of water, and so on. Well, thank you. Francisco, thank you very much. I'm sure that there are going to be lots of questions at the end. Andrea, Osses, She is a civil engineer, and currently she's working as the chief of the Division of Studies and Planning for the GA. Well, I'm here replacing the other director that had another commitment. So now in this Department of Studies and Planning, we cover this topic that is going to be presented, and Francisco give me this the floor, and also he made an introduction of that of the topic that I'm going to cover. This is in the article. This is quite specific. I don't know in how many acts it happens like this, but the strategic plans are in the Water Code, but also in the framework law of climate change. In terms of the climate change, we also have the strategic plans, and they said that the Ministry of Public Works is also doing that through the Department of Water and also the Water Rights Bureau. Also, when we try to generate a plan within a plan that has to do with the water recovery, with the aquifer recovery in the current and the future situations, and also, as Francisco said, there is where we've got alternative. And what are the things that we can do? And we've got the desalination, the reutilization, but we need to have a regulation framework. And if we don't have the regulation, then how can we implement it? So there we see the importance of this new initiative in terms of legislation to incorporate the work that we're doing in the strategic plans. I would like to tell you that in the strategic plans, we can implement them through regulation. The regulation was proposed by the end of last year, and they were under public consultation between December and January, and we entered that to the Controller's Office in April 2023, and currently they are being also filed to the Controller's Office because there is a work of comments, observations, and so many things that we need to solve and to see what the Controller is going to say, and then we need to change it. And now we're going to file that again, and hopefully this is going to be approved soon to start with the planification with the same climate urgency as María José just mentioned.
Something that we are proposing for this regulation, which is a tool for governance of the plan, is the strategic board of hydric resources. The idea for these boards is that they are led by the DGA, and it will be composed by actors from the basin, mainly the framework mentions that we have to act with some public entities such as the environmental ministry and others, the science ministry as well. But so that these plans can be carried out in the territory and they represent the people from the territory, there must be participation from the actors of said basin. The idea is for these boards to act throughout the whole development of the plans, and that they also incorporate themselves in the citizen participation plans, reviewing the plans and so on. And furthermore, to validate the diagnosis and the priorities of the basin. As we were mentioning before, there are some actors that are identified in the regulation, but there are also other actors that can be identified in the diagnosis, and for each basin they are going to be different. For example, the basin of Loa is going to be different than the basin of Biobío or a basin in Magallanes. And obviously there are sanitary companies in most of them, APRs, clients, associations in some basins, and in other basins they are not going to be there. So there are important and relevant actors that have been identified in the strategic plans of hydric management. We have made 48 different strategic plans. It's been a very relevant work since 2019, and that work is going to be incorporated now in everything that's the work for the strategic plans. Well, besides that, besides this tool, this management tool that we have for climate change and hydric resources that are strategic plans, we also know that the framework for climate change has given us different tools, which is the sectorial plans. So as for example, the adaptation plan, but the Ministry of Public Works is also developing right now 3 different plans, which is the mitigation and adaptation plan, that is being worked by the GDOP, and it's being to be developed by them. Also infrastructure and building, public building. Well, as I was mentioned, the strategic plans of hydric resources are both in the water code and the framework, but we also have the adaptation plan as a tool at the state level that regulates and gives the main guidelines for how to structure the topics of hydric resources and climate change. Currently, to develop the adaptation plan to climate change, this is a commitment that has been dragged since 2015 or so, when the National Climate Change Adaptation Plan was first developed. And by the end of last year, we finally got the support from the Green Fund, which was done through the Ministry of Finance, and it's going to be carried out through the Food and Agriculture Organization, jointly with the Public Works Ministry and Environmental Ministry, and this is something that we have been working on since March of this year, to be able to implement it with the goal of June 2024, which is the goal, or what the framework law is asking us to do in its transitory article, which says that all sectorial plans must be ready 2 years after the law has been passed, and that means June 2024. So that's a very hard work that we have ahead of us, because it requires a lot of citizen participation. There's early participation, public consultation. It has to go through a team, a specialized team of academics, and then through the Committee of Ministers for Sustainability. So it's a long process until June 2024, and there's a lot of ministries that are working to be able to deliver this on time. And I also wanted to highlight that from the DGA, we already started the early consultation, citizen participation for this, and I ask you that you enter our website. You are going to see a banner where we are receiving all the information. We are carrying out a survey, and we need your opinion, because you are part of the people who are interested in working with hydric resources, and we need your opinion. So if you can enter that page and answer the survey, that would be very valuable to us. We're going to upload the information about the file when we start with the resolution, because there's a lot of formalities there. And this is early participation, because the rules are not ready for the plan. So we are coordinating with the environmental agencies to see how we're going to carry this forward so that everything fits correctly. Now, I want to tell once more some of the topics that have been mentioned before by the Minister and by the Superintendent of Sanitary Services in regards to the limitations of the Ministry of Public Works for this multi-purpose infrastructure, and which basically allowed for the current laws that we have, this short bill that was approved that introduces solutions based on nature which are very strong in this framework for climate change, but are not part of the Ministry of Public Works, and are also not considered in the guidelines for investment of the Ministry of Social Development. So having them in the Ministry of Public Works is at least a basis to present these recommendations to the Ministry of Social Development. So this is all things that have been mentioned before. I don't know if I should go back to that, but it's basically the different bills that make it possible what we're doing in terms of planning, of hydric planning. So the importance that we can continue moving forward and that soon they can be passed and we can continue working with the things that we are doing in terms of planning. Thank you very much. Thank you, all three of you, for your presentations. I have a very open question and regards public policy and innovation, because the conclusions are basically that the current system or the current structure as it is conceived constricts us to give a qualitative step to increase the supply sources. So in the different niches that you're working on and participating in, where do we have to innovate? Where do we have to put a click in the traditional logic so that we can allow for this kind of projects to be developed? Something that's aligned with what Jorge Rivas said when he said this is a topic of public policy. Well, seeing what the very law, the framework of climate change says about climate justice, it mentions that all of us, and I say those of us who have more water, we have to start paying and subsidizing those people that don't have water in the north, for example. So that's an open question. I know this is a very open question and that you have different fields of action. I can say something, and then you can add to it. In the modification to the water regulation, there's one very important, which is the Fund for Research and Innovation in Hydric Resources, which is also in the Article 219, and it establishes a special fund that is going to be controlled by the Ministry of Public Works precisely for innovation and research in hydric resources, which relates with the strategic plans to follow on them and identify the initiatives of where we can research and develop new sources. And of course, in this sense, there can be a lot of initiatives that are not only in terms of regulation, but also of innovation. So from a viewpoint of regulations, this fund exists, and the norms that are currently in discussion is the one that regulates the fund. Is that correct? In the modification to the code, there are three aspects that we're looking into in our study. There's the norms of the strategic plans, where there's a specific point for the fund, and there's another norm for regulation, because there existed the faculty for the DGA to coordinate the investment and research in terms of hydric resources, but now we are adding that the bodies, the DGA has the right to request information to the different public services and all bodies that receive public funds to inform on the research that is being carried out and the research in terms of hydric resources, and the DGA must receive that information and generate reports. And in the end, it's going to be a coordinator in terms of the investments that are being carried out in terms of hydric resources. And that regulation has been received by the Controller's Office. Of all the different norms that are there, in terms of the modifications to the framework and others, this is the first one that has been accepted by the Controller's Office. I don't know if I'm answering that question. No, what I wanted to say is today, from the sanitary viewpoint, we have a class transition from going to fossil fuels to renewables. We all say that we like this transition, having a clean mix, but somebody has to pay for it. And maybe it's not something that's very comfortable to talk about because nobody wants to raise the tariffs for energy or for drinking water. But if we want water and water that's more sustainable, some way we have to finance this, and it is either financed by the state or by all of us, maybe through a subsidy that's focused on those people who can pay the bills. But this is something that we have to come clean about. As long as we don't come clean about this, we're going to have very bad incentives that are make it very difficult for very important works that are urgent to face the issues brought by climate change. Thank you. Yes, I wanted to touch on the point that was mentioned by you. I don't know your name, sorry, Francisco. In telecommunications, we have a fund for the development of telecommunications, which was formed when cell phones were incorporated in our country, and it's still working today. And this allows for some sectors of the country that don't have the resources to access the internet, have the fund, and they can get resources. In the sanitary sector, the fact that the companies are regional and expressly by law there can be cross subsidies between them makes it very difficult for the person in Antofagasta. If he pays the cost of the production of water, he will pay a higher tariff than the people who live in Santiago. The solution that I see is creating a fund, starting from a legal initiative that allows for sanitary companies to contribute to this fund, and for this fund to finance works that currently don't have financing. We're not talking about studies or innovation aspects, we are talking about investment. So they are funds that must be larger. And I think that this reflects the concern of our superintendent in this regards. We need to have a legal initiative in this aspect. You, as lawyers, maybe you could draft it. Well, the short law in terms of public concessions, because when we have this figure of concessions, we have some subsidies, some revenues, and this allows for the state to cover this. So that's the first step. But of course, that's not enough, and a fund would be a very good alternative, in fact. My name is Pablo Casor, and we carry out small-scale projects for rural sectors, and my question aims towards that. How should we differentiate, in your opinion, the permits for small desalination plants for 100 houses, for example? And the second question, the DGA is in charge of fresh water, right? And if they are salty waters, underground salty waters, or waters that are heavily polluted, is it still falls into the scope of the DGA? Well, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a civil engineer, but what I understand is that the water code says continental waters. But what are waters? How do you define water? To what point of ppm or salinity? What the water code regulates is continental waters, so that means all the waters in the continent. And there's an acceptance that water with a certain concentration of salt stops being a hydric resource, a continental resource, and becomes brine. And that's why in some salt floods, the DGA doesn't have a say in the exploitation of the salt flats because that water is not considered continental fresh water due to the high concentration of salts. So the water code regulates up to that point what is not considered continental waters, and that's waters with a concentration, I don't know the exact ppm concentration, but it is very, very high, much higher than seawater. Oh, and yeah, regarding the permits, precisely, the issue is that in terms of the activities that are on the list of the SEAS law, it mentions the size that they have to have so that they can enter the system. Because it's not regulated for desalination, this is what happens. The companies don't know if they have to submit it or they don't have to submit it. And that's why they ask the SEA, and they say, I'm going to develop this project and I need to know if I have to submit the project or not. And small desalination plants present these requests, and the SEA usually says that they don't have to submit it. But precisely because we don't have that certainty, we need to have it on the list, and we can clarify how many liters per hour, for example, need to be considered to enter the system.
Good afternoon. I am from University of Valparaiso. I'm Mrs. Morales. You have been talking about investment and innovation, but all that innovation, you need to have trained people to do so. Have you think how to train, or have you considered doing some sort of investment in the academia to have really trained people to do all these projects, some engineers that will really have the necessary competences to have a good plan and a good project? Do you have any approach from you to the academia in general? Well, in general, this Department of Studies and Planning from the DGA normally work with universities, and we also work with a consultant company. There are some universities in Chile that are very well trained to work in this area. So we have been working with the Catholic University, with engineering, faculty of engineering at the University of Chile, and up from the U of Concepcion, both in Chillán and also with the EULA. So there is a lot of installed capacity, and there is a lot of training in terms of doing some doctorate studies abroad, and that is the Ministry of Science as well. And we as DGA, as Francisco said, we also have a modification of the water code when we incorporated this fund for innovation and education on the water resource. So as soon as we've got the regulation, we can have this area for financing where you can apply as a university to reinforce this research. So that is what I would like to share with you. Hi. Good afternoon. Daniela Morales from the Catholic University of the Santísima Concepción. I've got a question. Maybe tomorrow will be the better day to ask this question. But you were talking about the desalination is some sort of the solution to obtain sustainable water. But what nobody mentioned is that that solution generates lots of residues, which is brine. What is the solution that you have said? What is the regulation? Or how can we reuse that brine afterwards? I'm sorry, but they need to use a microphone for us to interpret. I'm sorry, please use a microphone so we can interpret. Disculpen, no podemos interpretar si no están utilizando micrófonos. So you're saying that there's going to be a balance, right? Por favor, utilice el micrófono para la interpretación. Please use your microphone for the interpretation. I just want to clarify something because in the topics of water resources, strategic plans, and adaptation plans, the idea is not to be thinking about only one source and the means that is going to save us with this water resource. I would say that this is a joint solution. We need to see the infrastructure management, and there are so many things. We need to diversify this matter. It will not depend on only one source. Desalination, the reuse of what it is, the shallow waters or underground waters. The idea is to incorporate the different sources and to diversify the metrics. And if something fails, you will have a backup, and we need to see all the alternatives. Hi. I am from Corfo, from Coquimbo. I have three things to discuss. The first thing has to do with the capturing. I'm not talking about the sewage pipelines, and we use the Spanish one or the Australian regulation, which is more demanding with a 5% of tolerance of a higher desalination. The international reference, but the thing is with the capturing is the question if you are going to include it into this proposal with this future law of desalination, because there is a topic when we talk about the discharge and the effect of a higher desalination in the sea. We don't talk much about the trophic chain, the larvae that are affected, and all the sea life in the suctioning and the pre-treatment to protect the membranes from biofouling. So do we need to include that in terms of the competition for the desalination? Because the second thing, if you're going to propose a deficit or a gap that there is in the mix of the current laws, I'm going to give you an example. I'm not going to say the name of the company. I'm not going to, but in the Kilimari River, in Pichidangi, there is a sanitary company, an urban company, contaminated the aquifer by discharging their brine of two reverse osmosis in the Kilimari River. In order to avoid the permits, they didn't discharge it to the sea. We analyzed it with the superintendents, with the DTA, with the CIS, and with the health undersecretary. And there is no regulation because, first of all, there are less than 10,000 inhabitants. And there is a big difference if it is real or not. But in terms of the regulation of the DTA, the contamination of the aquifer is real and it exists. So we still have no one's land because this is the law of climate change, as María José mentioned, and also the urgency, and also which you should analyze the gap that we've got in the regulations or the current regulation, so that we should stop having that environmental disaster. And the third thing and the last thing is regarding several regulations. The national director of the CS says that it was safe to have a to have a tap water. And what about the bottom? Because it is 0.5, the recommendation for that. But in Chile, we don't have a regulation for the bottom for the human consumption. And what would happen regarding the how hard it is at the silica, and also that is not regulated. And it is also very important in the legislation that we are proposing for the reuse and talking about the water quality, everything that has to do with the quality of water in the legislation, and both for desalination and the products that will come out of that for the drinkable water, and that is regulated. So we will have quantity, and there is another bill that has to do with the regulation. So if we've got that bill, maybe we will include it. But what exists is that we've got these guidelines of the SEA, and that has to do with the guidelines of the marine ecosystem that deals with the capturing and also what is the impact in the sea system. So maybe the legislation will come late, but what we're trying to do in this environmental assessment is just that we're trying to be before this, and in these two things we will find some more information, and also when are we going to have a more environmental impact. Can you please give us 2 minutes? Well, I've got a question for you that has to do with this bill about the reuse, and this is the definition of residual waters. This is a broad definition, and if we include this brine into this definition, that will be a huge limitation for the development of the desalination. And so to make sure the water balance that we need. Well, this is a topic that has been broadly commented, and this is quite broad, and as it is, we can understand that the brine is another residual water, and if we've got this the Supreme Decree is 90, so we should not discharge that brine to the sea. This bill, and it has some aspects that need to be improved, or if we've got this exception in the desalination processes, or if we indicate that we will continue the table 4 and 5 of this Supreme Decree number 90 that is ruling this. And well, I think that you answered all those questions quite well.